April 26, 1986, 1:30 a.m. Nikolai Glukhov jolts awake to explosions that shake his farmhouse 18 kilometers from Chernobyl. Through the window, an orange sky glowing like midday sun. His wife is screaming. Neighbors are already loading trucks, fleeing south. In his hand, a rusted barn key. 6 hours ago, he gave it to a stranger, a Soviet engineer named Aleksandr Yuvchenko, who asked to sleep in the loft. At dinner, Yuvchenko mentioned a safety test at Reactor 4, scheduled for after midnight. Now the radio crackles. Minor accident. Remain calm. But the sky says otherwise. Glukhov's children are crying. His wife grabs his arm. We have to go now. The barn key presses into his palm. The stranger is still out there, 18 kilometers closer to hell. Glukhov has maybe 10 minutes before radiation blankets the village. He makes a decision that defies every survival instinct. What the engineer told him at dinner, one sentence about guilt, would explain everything. The stranger appeared at Glukhov's gate on the evening of April 25th, 1986, just before sunset. Nikolai Glukhov, 52 years old, was finishing his usual routine, checking livestock, securing the barn, preparing for another ordinary night on his farm 18 kilometers southeast of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The man at the gate looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, hands that wouldn't stop moving. He introduced himself as Aleksandr Yuvchenko, a shift foreman at Chernobyl. He needed a place to sleep, just one night. Ukrainian hospitality is a code, especially in rural areas where strangers are rare but trust runs deep. Glukhov's wife, Katerina, was suspicious. Why isn't he staying in Pripyat with the other plant workers? But Glukhov waved her off. The man looked haunted. At the dinner table, Yuvchenko barely touched his food. He mentioned the test scheduled for later that night, a safety procedure on Reactor 4, delayed from the day shift. We're reducing power to see how the cooling system responds, he said quietly. His hand shook as he lifted his tea. Glukhov handed him the barn key, old, rusted, same one his father had used. The loft's clean. Sleep as long as you need. At 10 p.m., Glukhov watched Yuvchenko climb the barn ladder and disappear into the hay. The key went into Glukhov's pocket. Kindness to strangers is a debt you pay forward. That night, routine became catastrophe. What Glukhov didn't know? Aleksandr Yuvchenko's world was a pressure cooker of Soviet bureaucracy and ignored warnings. Chernobyl employed 14,000 people. The town of Pripyat, built specifically for plant workers and their families, housed 50,000. Reactor 4 was one of 4 RBMK reactors, known for instability at low power, but praised by Soviet engineers as monuments to progress. In April 1986, a safety test was approved, despite multiple engineers raising concerns. The test parameters had been reduced. Protocols designed to prevent disaster were being bypassed to meet a deadline. Yuvchenko had signed off on the plan under pressure from his superiors, but privately he was terrified. He'd filed violation reports weeks earlier, stacks of paperwork locked in his locker, ignored by plant management. His colleagues dismissed him as paranoid. "You worry too much, Sasha," they'd say. But Yuvchenko couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong. That's why he didn't go home to his wife and daughter in Pripyat that evening. He couldn't face them knowing what might happen in a few hours. So he walked to the nearest farm and knocked on a stranger's door. Glukhov saw a tired man seeking sleep. Yuvchenko was seeking something else, a moment of peace before facing a decision he couldn't undo. The machinery of disaster runs on ignored warnings. 3 hours later, those warnings would explode. By 11 p.m., the village was silent. 32 families, mostly farmers, settled into their routines. Glukhov followed his nightly pattern, check the perimeter, smoke one cigarette by the barn, lock up, bed by midnight. The spring air smelled clean. Crickets filled the darkness. In the distance, the faint hum of the Chernobyl plant, a sound so constant that locals had stopped hearing it years ago. The barn key reflected moonlight as Glukhov set it on his nightstand. His wife, Katerina, was already asleep beside him. Their 2 children, 12 and 9, were in the next room. Everything felt ordinary. Inside the barn loft, Yuvchenko lay awake, staring at wooden beams. He could hear the distant hum of Reactor 4, 18 kilometers away. The test was scheduled to begin at 1:05 a.m., delayed from the day shift due to power grid demands. At 1:23 a.m., the test would reach its critical phase, reducing reactor power to see if the cooling pumps could run on residual steam. Yuvchenko knew the parameters were wrong. He knew the safety margins had been cut too thin. But he'd signed the paperwork. He was complicit. Outside, a diesel generator hummed. Inside, Yuvchenko's mind raced. Peace is just the silence before someone makes a mistake. At 1:23:40 a.m., the world split open. The explosion came in 2 waves. First, a deep, gut-shaking blast that lifted Reactor 4's 2,000-ton steel lid like it was cardboard. Second, a fireball that shot debris and radioactive material 10 kilometers into the sky. The roof of Reactor 4 was gone. 190 tons of uranium fuel exposed to open air. Glukhov jolted awake. His first thought, earthquake. His second, war. He ran outside in his undershirt and pants. The sky, orange, glowing like midday sun, pulsing with heat. Debris was raining down across the landscape. His wife, Katerina, was already grabbing the children, shouting at them to get dressed. Neighbors were running into the street. Truck engines starting. Headlights cutting through the unnatural glow. The radio crackled to life. Minor accident at the Chernobyl plant. Remain calm. Await further instructions. Glukhov looked toward the orange sky and knew that was a lie. He grabbed the barn key from his nightstand. His mind flashed to the engineer, Yuvchenko, asleep in the loft, or dead. Katerina grabbed his arm. Nikolai, we have to leave now. The children... Glukhov looked at the key in his fist, then at his truck keys on the counter, his wife's face, the glowing sky. He had maybe 10 minutes before radiation spread across the village. Heroism starts as a stupid thought you can't ignore. He had to go back. At 1:35 a.m., Glukhov started his truck. Every vehicle in the village was moving away from the reactor. Families, livestock crammed into flatbeds, headlights forming a desperate convoy heading south. Glukhov turned his truck north. Katerina was screaming at him from the porch. You'll kill yourself. Forget about him. But Glukhov couldn't. At dinner, Yuvchenko had said something. One sentence, quiet, almost to himself. I needed to tell someone before I faced it. The time. Glukhov thought he meant the test. Now he understood. The engineer knew something terrible was coming and couldn't go home to his family carrying that weight alone. Confession needed a witness. The road was chaos. People on foot, cars stalled, a tractor blocking half the lane. The smell in the air, burning metal, something chemical that made Glukhov's eyes water. Sirens wailing from the direction of Pripyat. The orange glow ahead growing brighter. The barn key dangled from the ignition, bouncing with every pothole. 18 kilometers. 12-minute drive if he pushed it. Glukhov's hands were shaking. His truck engine roared. He passed a military convoy heading toward the plant, soldiers in hazmat suits, their faces pale behind plastic visors. Fear is negotiable when someone's counting on you. By 1:47 a.m., Glukhov reached his farm. The barn was still standing. He unlocked the door with shaking hands, climbed the ladder to the loft. The blanket was empty. Hay scattered. No sign of Yuvchenko. But the engineer isn't in the barn. Glukhov's heart dropped. Betrayal flooded his mind. Did the stranger lie and leave? Use his hospitality as cover and disappear? Then he heard it. Coughing. Wet, desperate coughing from below. Glukhov descended the ladder and found Yuvchenko collapsed near the barn entrance, half hidden in shadow. The engineer was conscious, but barely. His skin already looked wrong. Flushed. Mottled. Radiation sickness doesn't wait. Yuvchenko's eyes found Glukhov's. I tried to warn them, he whispered. His voice was hoarse, broken. I filed reports. I told them the parameters were unsafe. They ignored me. The barn key had fallen from Glukhov's hand and was now rolling across the dirt floor, stopping near Yuvchenko's outstretched fingers. Glukhov knelt beside him. Can you stand? Yuvchenko nodded weakly. Glukhov pulled him upright, shoulder under the engineer's arm. The smell. Burned hair. Something metallic. Yuvchenko's uniform was covered in fine gray dust. Radioactive particles. Glukhov didn't know the science, but he knew death when he saw it approaching. Why did you come to my farm? Glukhov asked as they stumbled toward the truck. Yuvchenko's answer came in fragments. Couldn't face my family. Knew what we were doing. Needed to confess to someone who didn't know me. The engineer's weight was heavy. Glukhov dragged him to the truck, propped him in the passenger seat. The barn key landed on the dashboard. Both men in the cab now, engine roaring. Driving south, away from the orange glow that pulsed like a second sun. Sometimes people run toward disaster to fix what they broke. They had 8 minutes before roadblocks sealed the zone. At 1:52 a.m., Glukhov's truck sped south on back roads, avoiding the main evacuation routes. Yuvchenko was talking through the pain, words spilling out like a confession he'd been holding for weeks. I signed off on the test, he said. I knew the power levels were too low. I knew the safety systems were compromised. But my supervisor, he said it was approved from Moscow. He said refusing would mean my career, my family's apartment in Pripyat, everything. Glukhov kept his eyes on the road. So you ran. I didn't run, Yuvchenko said, voice breaking. I came to your farm because I needed to tell someone before I faced it, before I went back to the plant to see what we'd done. That's when Glukhov understood. The engineer wasn't fleeing the disaster. He was preparing to return to it. Dinner at Glukhov's table wasn't hospitality. It was last confession. According to documented reports, Aleksandr Yuvchenko did survive the Chernobyl disaster, suffering acute radiation syndrome that required months of treatment. But the version of events told here, his presence at a nearby farm hours before the explosion, adds a human dimension to the engineering failure. Whether he truly confessed to a farmer or faced the disaster alone, the guilt remained. The barn key rattled on, the dashboard, as the truck bounced over rural roads. Glukhov's hands were cramping, early symptoms he didn't yet recognize. Yuvchenko was fading, muttering names of colleagues still inside the reactor building. Toptunov, Akimov, they're still in there. His eyes were closing. Confession is the debt we pay before we pay the price. Ahead, through the darkness, Glukhov saw headlights, a military checkpoint, soldiers in hazmat suits, radiation scanners. They had 8 minutes before the zone was completely sealed. Subscribe, because what happens at that checkpoint will decide everything. The checkpoint appeared at 2:08 a.m., 15 kilometers from the reactor. Soldiers in full hazmat suits, radiation scanners mounted on tripods, orders to turn everyone back. Glukhov slowed the truck. Yuvchenko was slumped in the passenger seat, barely conscious. A soldier approached, flashlight beam cutting through the cab. "Road's closed. Turn around." Glukhov's mind raced. "My brother," he said, gesturing to Yuvchenko. "He works at the plant. He's sick. I need to get him to a hospital." The soldier hesitated. He aimed the radiation scanner at the truck. The device beeped. Slow at first, then faster, then a steady whine. Yuvchenko's radiation levels were off the chart. The soldier stepped back, consulted with another. Glukhov could see the calculation happening behind their visors. Protocol versus compassion. One person dying versus orders from Moscow. Within 3 hours of the explosion, the Soviet military had sealed a 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl, a documented fact that underscores the speed of institutional response even as human chaos unfolded. The soldier marked the truck with red chalk, a diagonal slash across the hood. "Go," he said quietly. "Hospitals in Chernihiv, 80 kilometers south. Don't stop." Glukhov nodded, shifted gears, drove through. The barn key was still visible on the dashboard. The soldier noticed it. Old, rusted, ordinary. He said nothing. Behind them, more cars were being turned back. Yuvchenko's skin was already showing burns, red patches spreading across his neck and hands, his breathing shallow. "I thought I could stop it," he whispered. "I thought filing reports would matter." Glukhov didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Authority bends when the body count rises. The real danger wasn't behind them anymore. It was in their lungs, their blood, their bones. Radiation doesn't negotiate. In a minute, you'll see why the hospital run became a race against cellular collapse. By 2:34 a.m., Glukhov reached the nearest hospital in Chernihiv, 80 kilometers south of the disaster. The sun was starting to rise, a normal sunrise, incongruent with the nightmare they'd just escaped. The hospital was already in chaos. Every bed filling with Chernobyl plant workers, firefighters, soldiers, nurses running between rooms, doctors shouting for potassium iodide, blood transfusions, anything to slow the radiation damage. According to historical records, 134 plant workers and emergency responders were hospitalized with acute radiation syndrome in the days following the disaster. Glukhov half-carried Yuvchenko through the emergency entrance. The engineer was fading fast, muttering names, fragments of technical jargon, apologies to people who weren't there. A doctor took one look at Yuvchenko's burns and radiation meter readings and shouted for a gurney. As they wheeled him away, Yuvchenko grabbed Glukhov's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't have to come back." Glukhov watched them disappear down a corridor. His own hands were cramping now. Early radiation symptoms. Muscle pain. Nausea starting to build. A nurse approached. "You were exposed too. You need treatment." Glukhov shook his head. The barn key was in his pocket, a physical anchor. "My family. They're still near the zone. I have to—" "Your family is gone," the nurse said, not unkindly. "Everyone within 30 kilometers has been evacuated or is fleeing. You can't go back." But Glukhov wasn't thinking about evacuation routes or radiation levels. He was thinking about his wife, his children, the home he'd left behind, the documents, the photos, the life that existed 6 hours ago. Every rescue has a hidden price tag. Glukhov left the hospital at 3:15 a.m., ignoring the nurses who called after him. He had one more trip to make, one last chance to salvage something from the wreckage. If you're hooked now, wait till you hear what he finds when he returns. At 3:15 a.m., Glukhov drove north again, back toward the exclusion zone, back toward his farm. An impossible decision. Stay at the hospital for treatment, or save what remained of his former life. His wife, Katerina, had already evacuated their children to her brother's house 100 kilometers west, outside the danger zone. But the farm, the documents, the family photos, the proof that their life had existed, was still there. According to official records, 116,000 people were evacuated from the 30-kilometer exclusion zone within 36 hours of the disaster, a logistical operation of staggering scale. Glukhov's farm sat just inside that boundary. By the time he arrived, the sun was fully up. The orange glow had faded, replaced by an eerie normalcy. Birds singing, fields looking untouched. But the air tasted wrong, metallic, chemical. The barn was still standing. Glukhov unlocked it with the rusted key. Everything inside exactly as he'd left it. Hay scattered where Yuvchenko had slept. The blanket folded on a beam. Glukhov walked to his house. The front door unlocked. Kitchen table still set with breakfast dishes from the morning before. He gathered what he could. Birth certificates, a wedding photo, his father's watch, a handful of letters. The barn key he placed deliberately on the kitchen table beside a photo of his family, all 4 of them, taken the previous summer. ACR, thumbnail moment. The key catching morning light, resting against the faces of people who would never return here. The house smelled like smoke now, distant and invasive. Glukhov stood in the doorway, looking at the life he was leaving behind. Home is just a place until you can never return. He pocketed the key again, walked out, locked the door, drove south. This time, he didn't look back. The barn key had transformed from a tool into a talisman, the only physical proof of the decision that changed 2 lives. In the weeks ahead, that key would become the center of a story neither man could escape. May 1986. Glukhov's family lived in a displacement camp outside Kyiv, along with thousands of other evacuees. Temporary shelters, medical checkups every other day, the slow realization that temporary might mean forever. Aleksandr Yuvchenko survived, though barely. He underwent bone marrow transplants, experimental treatments, months in isolation as his body fought radiation damage. The EU official death toll from Chernobyl stood at 31 in the immediate aftermath, though thousands more would die from long-term radiation exposure over the following decades. Glukhov was tested. Early-stage radiation poisoning, recoverable with treatment. The doctors said he was lucky. He didn't feel lucky. The barn key stayed in his pocket constantly, a physical reminder of the decision he'd made at 1:35 a.m. on April 26th. He couldn't let go of it. At night, lying in the camp cot, he'd turn it over in his fingers, feeling the rust, the worn edges. During the day, it sat on his bedside table during medical treatments, a thumbnail moment that nurses noticed but never asked about. The media found him in June. Heroic farmer saves reactor engineer. The headlines spread through Soviet newspapers, then international press. Reporters asked him why he went back. Glukhov's answer was always the same. He was a guest in my home. He never mentioned the confession, never talked about Yuvchenko's guilt or the words spoken at dinner. That was private. The truth was more complex than heroism. Both men had saved and damned each other. Yuvchenko's confession had given Glukhov a reason to return. Glukhov's rescue had given Yuvchenko a chance to live with his guilt instead of dying with it. Heroes are just people who acted before they could reconsider. By August, the media moved on. The displacement camps began to empty as families relocated permanently. Glukhov's family settled in a small apartment in Kiev, far from the farm they'd never see again. The barn key went into a drawer. But Yuvchenko's full story, the warnings he filed, the reports he signed, the confession he needed to make, never made it into official records. That version belonged only to two men. The decades that followed were marked by silence and slow revelation. Between 1991 and 2006, Nikolai Glukhov became a reluctant symbol of Chernobyl heroism, but he gave few interviews and avoided public ceremonies when possible. Aleksandr Yuvchenko, meanwhile, recovered enough to give testimony about the disaster's causes, becoming an activist for nuclear safety and a voice for the workers whose warnings had been ignored. The two men stayed in contact. Occasional letters, brief phone calls, a shared burden that no one else could fully understand. In 2006, Yuvchenko died from radiation-related cancer at age 53, 2 decades after the disaster. His final letter to Glukhov arrived a week after his death. "You saved a coward. Thank you for not knowing that." Glukhov read the letter alone in his Kiev apartment. He placed it in a wooden box beside the barn key and wept. Not for the first time, but perhaps the most honest. Yuvchenko wasn't a coward. The engineer had returned to the reactor after the explosion to help evacuate others, suffering radiation exposure that would eventually kill him. The confession at Glukhov's farm wasn't about cowardice. It was about complicity, about signing paperwork that enabled disaster, about needing one moment of honesty before facing the consequences. Glukhov understood that now. In 2011, Chernobyl was finally sealed under the new safe confinement dome, a massive steel structure designed to contain the radiation for another century. 32,000 tons of steel, 108 meters high, covering the ruins of Reactor 4. Glukhov watched the news coverage in silence, the barn key on the table beside him. The place where he'd handed that key to a stranger no longer existed in any meaningful sense. It was frozen in time, abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by forest and radiation. Survival is just a longer way to carry guilt. The barn key's meaning had transformed completely. Once a simple tool for locking a barn, it had become a memorial to a night when two men, one burdened by guilt, one by compassion, collided in the hours before catastrophe. In 2023, Glukhov's grandson found the key in a frame on the kitchen wall. The farmer had died 4 years earlier at age 85, never having returned to the abandoned farm 18 kilometers from Chernobyl. The grandson, 26, was visiting his grandmother in Kiev when he noticed the photograph beside the key. Two men standing near a barn, one in Soviet engineer uniform, one with weathered farmer's hands. "Why is this key in a frame?" he asked. His grandmother, Katerina, now 88, touched the glass. "That key saved a man's life," she said quietly, "and maybe took another." The grandson researched the story. He found Yuvchenko's testimony in archived Soviet documents, discovered the engineer's activism in the years before his death, read interviews where Yuvchenko mentioned a farmer who came back for me. He found news articles from 1986 calling his grandfather a hero. But one detail emerged that his grandmother had never shared. In Yuvchenko's personal archives, donated to a Chernobyl museum after his death, was a recorded interview from 1998. In it, Yuvchenko described the dinner at Glukhov's farm the night before the disaster. "I told him I should have stopped them," Yuvchenko said on the recording. "That sentence, those 5 words, I think that's why he came back for me. Not because I was a stranger in his barn, because I'd confessed something he recognized as human." The grandson played the recording for his grandmother. She listened in silence, tears forming. "Your grandfather never told me that part," she said. "He just said the man was a guest. That was enough." The barn still stands in the exclusion zone, visible on satellite imagery, slowly decaying, surrounded by forest that has reclaimed the abandoned village. The key in the frame is rusted beyond use now, but it unlocks something more permanent than a barn door. It locks in responsibility. Moral closure arrives quietly. One man's guilt became another's purpose. The keys we carry aren't for doors. They're for debts we'll never finish paying.